A few inches later. A few minutes later. A few moments later. A little later. A little longer than a few minutes later. A lot of boring math later. Approximately 10 hours later. By sheer coincidence. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. Early the next morning. 8 hours later. 8 hours later. 11 minutes later. Epilogue. Epilogue. Eventually. 5 hours later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 4 to 6 weeks later. Graduation day. Just then. Later. Later that same evening. Later, in the void. Later. Many hours later. Many months later. Many tic-tacs later. Many unbearable hours later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, moments later, montage. More moments later, much later, much later, much later. One debt to society later. One eternity later. One extremely annoying shift later. One frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later. One long angry line later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. One pair of pants later. 1 semester later. 1 shift later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 winner later. Opening night. 7 hours later. Several bad puns later. Several days later. Several months later. Several song-filled hours later. 6.5 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6 months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Soon after. 10 seconds later. The following day. The following Thursday. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. Thousands of tears later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 hours later. 3 days later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. Tomorrow for sure. Tomorrow. 20 minutes later. 12 seconds later. 2 days later. 2 hours 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 later. 2 very boring minutes later. 2 weeks later. Yesterday. 12 o'clock midnight. 15 minutes later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2,000 years later. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 3,000 years later. 346 minutes later. 3:28 a.m. 48 hours later.
70 years later.
72 hours later. 75 years later. 7:59 a.m. 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 82 kilometers later. 8:01 p.m.